I'm Michael Krasny, and I want to welcome you to another live episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, a global podcast. We do weekly deep dive interviews with national and international authors, artists, journalists, business leaders, entertainers, and experts and opinion shapers in a wide range of fields and disciplines. We also welcome and include your questions and comments, so feel free to bring them to the fore. And we invite you also to become a member as we cover a wide range of intellectually engaging topics and issues distinguished by high-level content and technical excellence. To become a member of this podcast, simply go to graymatter.show, and that's gray with an E. In this episode, we talked to Larry Tye, who is a Nieman Fellow at Harvard and an award-winning reporter at the Boston Globe. He also runs the Boston-based Health Coverage Fellowship, and he's the author of the New York Times bestselling books Satchel, about the great ageless pitcher, Satchel Paige, and Bobby Kennedy, a biography of RFK Sr., and he is also the author of a number of other books, which I'll mention. Demagogue, which is essentially a book about Senator Joe McCarthy. He wrote a book called Superman about, Superman. And The Father of Spin, which is about Edward Bernays, the pioneer of public relations and propaganda, and also the nephew of Sigmund Freud. Rising from the Rails, Homelands recently published a book that we're really going to focus on called Jazzmen, How Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, and Count Basie Transformed America. Welcome, Larry Tye. Good to have you with us.
Great to be back with you, Michael. Thank you.
Well, there's a lot to talk about in this book, and it has to do with something that's indigenous to America. That is, they used to say jazz and Levi's and baseball, and certainly this is about three of the greatest jazz icons that America produced. The troika, as you say, of Pied Pipers, three geniuses who stood for, racial justice and transformed America, as you say. That's the thesis of the book. I want to get into all that with you, but first, I ticked off all these books that are under your belt and that are in your personal canon. How do you decide who you want to write about or what you want to write about?
This one was easy because, as you mentioned, I wrote an earlier book on the Pullman Porters, and these extraordinary black men who, from the end of the Civil War to the 1960s, were earning more money, seeing more of the country, and having a bigger influence, arguably, than any blacks in this country. When I got done writing about them, they made me promise that I would write two other books. One was on the favorite athlete that they carried on their trains, and that was a guy named Satchel Paige, and a few years ago I did that. But they were really determined that someday I would write a book on their three favorite passengers who were named Ellington, Armstrong, and Basie. And the reason the Porters cared about them, to me, said a lot about why these three jazz guys were different in a way that I'd never understood. When these jazzmen, who were at the top of their field for a full half century, when they traveled south, it was really dangerous if they went into the wrong restaurant or tried to find a room in a hotel that didn't serve blacks. They could get beat up, or they could end up at the end of a lynching noose. And so the only way that they could ensure that they had somewhere safe to go to was rent a private Pullman sleeping car. They would take it south with them, and if they were going and doing concerts in a place like Atlanta, they would have the sleeping car on the sidetrack, and at night, when they got done with their concert, they could go back, and the Pullman porters would give them an extraordinary meal. They would make up a comfortable bed for them, and in return, and in the middle of the night, the jazzmen would have a private jam session just for the Pullman porters. And so anything the Pullman porters told me to do, I tried to do, but the idea that to stay alive, you had to rent your own floating hotel was shocking to me.
It also brings to mind that movie, The Green Book, and that whole notion that blacks who went traveling in the South, one thinks about all the terrible things that happened to so many, even great black performers. Nat King Cole, for example, comes quickly to mind. The racial segregation and the dangers that they were in with Jim Crow and so forth. But how does this tie in with the idea that they, especially this trio, extraordinary men, geniuses, as you say, transformed America?
I think what they did was pretty simple. What they did was opened America's eyes and ears and soul to the magnificence of their melodies, that they took their music to white men who would never have let a black cross their threshold, and yet these guys were wooing their sweethearts with ballads from Louis Armstrong or Duke Ellington for white women who, when a black man was walking towards them on a sidewalk, would cross over to the other side of the street. When they got into the privacy of their own living room, they clicked their heels to the music of Count Basie. There was some way, and I think it was a magical way, that race for the first time fell away as an issue when you were listening to black artists perform music that was just out of this world.
Well, as you say in your book, they gave remedies in the blues for everyday life, and that's certainly the case. I mean, I think about something like, I don't know if you know James Baldwin's great story, Sonny's Blues, but, it exemplifies for me just the power of this music. You can't read a story like that without realizing how deep it goes and the sensibility of it and the just visceral response that so many people have. And we're talking about people who may have been really bigoted or deep down. I mean, there's a example of a story that you use. I think it's Ellington. In fact, it's Duke Ellington at Yale. When he's sitting down to eat dinner, and some guy says to him, "I don't eat with ends," and just gets up. And Ellington had the kind of class to say, "Okay, let's just eat our meal here. Let's have our dinner." They were facing this stuff all the time, this kind of stuff.
They did, and they did it with exactly the grace and the elegance that Ellington showed at that dinner at Yale. And they also pushed back. All three of them insisted that they let their music speak for itself and they weren't going to speak out overtly about race issues. And all three of them spoke out in incredibly powerful ways about race issues. They were pushed so hard, they'd be performing at the biggest nightclub in Las Vegas and they'd have to go in through the kitchen because black entertainers or black help or whoever you were not allowed in the front door. And at a point when you suffered that kind of indignity long enough, you just had to push back. And these guys did it in ways that I think set the table for the civil rights movement. But what I think doesn't matter, the guy who said that they set the table for his movement was Martin Luther King Jr. And he said jazz was the way of bringing the magnificence of what blacks could do into an American consciousness that made things like Brown versus Board possible.
Wasn't it King also who said their music is the soundtrack of the civil rights movement?
So it was me who said that, and it was paraphrasing King, and it was absolutely true. And it wasn't just Martin Luther King. It was everybody from Malcolm X to Jackie Robinson, all of whom realized that long before baseball was integrated, long before institutions like schools were integrated, music was integrated. People went to clubs that they called black and tans. Black and white audiences were there together. And when you took music into your house, you weren't racially segregating who the musician was. You were listening and you were celebrating.
Well, they're barrier breakers, too. I think that's your language. For example, make the analogy to somebody like Joe Louis and what he did for boxing, or for that matter, you talk about Paul Robeson and what he did for the theater. I mean, these are major figures, a trio of them, no less.
A trio of them who, like Louis in the end wasn't known as a great black boxer. He was known as a great boxer. Paul Robeson wasn't known as a great black actor. He was just a great actor. And that's what these three wanted. They wanted the black adjective to fall off so that people could see that they were just the best at what they did.
That's what Ralph Ellison wanted for his novel, The Invisible Man, also. I mean, that was the ethos at the time. I think we've gone through some changes now. One of those changes may apply to the fact that a lot of people who are, let's say, of the Caucasian race, like you, doing books about black people who face some cultural appropriation kinds of comments or things along those lines. Have you had any of that kind of feedback?
I haven't, but I expect I will see it. And so I would argue a couple things. One is, as I said, it was the Pullman Porters who told me to do this book. And with the Pullman Porters, they didn't care whether I was green and from the planet Mars. I was the guy who was there to tell their story when they were old men and worried that they would go to their graves without telling it. The three people who I think would be the biggest defenders that the color of the skin of the author doesn't matter were three guys named Ellington, Armstrong, and Basie. They spent their lives trying to make us a more colorblind world, and I totally get the issues of cultural expropriation, But I would just say that that my book hopefully stands on its own. And I've had the nicest blurbs that I got on the book, the little squibs on the back of the book where people say nice things about it, are from leading Black artists and entertainers.
Well, again, congratulations on the book. I think it's really a fine book and it stands up on its own. And we're maybe too sensitive to some of these racial issues because we're so polarized now. But I thought of something else in conjunction with your book, which is that, and I think you've actually addressed this, you came into writing this not only because of the Pullman Porters, but because of your respect and admiration, which was strong and remains strong, I know, for these extraordinary men. And yet you discovered facts about them. They were on the road a lot and they, shall we say, did the kind of swinging, and we're not talking about with jazz. It's not only that, but a lot of drinking and a lot of gambling and a lot of sorts of things which I suppose humanize them and are true for so many artists of any color. But you kind of had to face all that, didn't you? Like people have had to face Martin Luther King's infidelities. You had to face infidelities of these men and so forth.
I did. So these were three men of very deep faith. They believed in God. They prayed before every meal. They all read the Bible, and Duke swore that he read it cover to cover 3 times. And yet, if you were listing the 10 commandments, I found a lot more that they broke than ones that they kept. And they justified it. They said, geez, how could we remain faithful to our wives when we're out on the road 300 days a year? That didn't wash. The Duke Ellington was my favorite when it came to that because he was the only one who had just one marriage in his life, but the marriage lasted about 2 years of a real marriage. And then the reason he didn't get divorced was it was a perfect excuse with all of his mistresses to say, I'm still married, I can't marry you. But these were guys who lived life hard. And at the end, they became to me even more heroic because they were flesh and blood heroes with all the foibles that we all have. And theirs were right out there for us to see if we looked hard enough.
Well, you also, you've done some extraordinary research here. You did about 250 interviews. All your books are very well researched, but you came across not only those human sides of these 3 men, but you also came across some other things that I think were probably pretty challenging, I would imagine, and that had to do with just the sense of trying to make sense out of their lives when they really faced a lot of adversity and they were mainly wedded perhaps more to their music than to anything else.
That is true. I want to say the things that united these guys were not just that they were born within 5 years of one another and that they were all jazz greats, but they did something that only you, Michael, could do today, which is they lasted at the top of their craft for a full half century. And I wanted to understand what it was in their backgrounds and what it was in their personalities and their set of skills that let them do that. And each of them came from a background of adversity. Louis Armstrong grew up in a neighborhood of New Orleans that was so tough that they called it the battlefield. And he spent 18 difficult months in a reform school called the Boys' Home for Colored Waifs. And it was just...
That's where he learned to play the horn, though, isn't it?
It is, but that's exactly what he did. So the same way that Satchel Paige had said, I traded 7 years of freedom in my reform school to learn how to pitch a baseball, Louis Armstrong was willing to give up those 18 months, first to learn the bugle, then the cornet, and finally the trumpet that we know him for. And everything that he suffered through in a Jim Crow New Orleans and in a tough neighborhood made him tougher and more sensitive. When he played the blues, he understood the blues. He was somebody who you felt like through the bell of his trumpet, you were watching his heart pour out, and only somebody who had gone through what he had gone through could, I think, emote in the way that he did. And the same was true in different ways for Ellington and Basie. Count Basie grew up in the supposedly enlightened North, but in fact, Red Bank, New Jersey wasn't a whole lot more integrated than New Orleans was, and Count Basie couldn't wait to get out of town. He initially thought the way out of town that he was going to join the circus, and then he realized he had a skill that could get him out even quicker. And he initially played in suburbs of New Jersey. Then he made it literally learning at the feet of Fats Waller. He sat at Waller's piano and watched his foot movement on the pedals, and it was extraordinary. And he took off in a way that was amazing. And Duke Ellington, at one point in his life, after he had turned down an art scholarship, he decided he was going to make his living by painting signs. And he ended up learning that an even better way to make a living was playing the piano. And he would go on to write 6,000 compositions, to orchestrate, to lead a band, and to be one of the world's greatest piano players. And all of these guys figured out a way to not just make a career, but make a difference.
Well, you didn't know a lot about music when you went into this, did you? I mean, in terms of the specifics of music and all of really what is difficult about understanding music in a greater sense.
So you're very polite. And the real way to phrase that question is, what's a tone-deaf guy like you doing writing a book about music? And the answer is, had I gone to people that I was interviewing, like Wynton Marsalis or Jon Batiste, the two great jazz guys from today's jazz world, had I gone to them and said, geez, I'm a music expert and I just want to ask you a few questions so I can quote you, they would have said, go away. I went to them instead and said, I know nothing about music and I want you to educate me. And they spent hours educating me. And what I knew was that I was writing not about these guys' lives as musicians. We already knew what great musicians they were. I was trying to zero in on their lives off the bandstand. And so basic skills of a reporter that I had been doing forever, plus being willing to learn, helped me see what these guys did in their music worlds, but in the wider world. And that, I think, is the half of their legacy that has been missing.
Well, Marsalis was and remains a great educator. And I had the opportunity to interview him, and he continues to teach, and he's just natural. He's a born pedagogue in many ways, just like a born musician. But I'm reminded of something that I really want to ask you along these lines, and that is, I mentioned Sonny's Blues by Baldwin, which I think is one of the great stories in the American canon about jazz and blues and heroin addiction to Harlem. It's got so much packed into it. But there's a younger brother who says to his older brother, he's trying to figure out his younger brother's sense of being drawn to music. And he says, Louis Armstrong? And he says, no, I'm not talking about Satchmo. That's old stuff, you know. And to some extent, we've seen and we've experienced this real shift. I mean, you can see the line, and even in a story like Sonny's Blues, it goes right through to hip hop and everything that's contemporary, going all the way back to spirituals. It's a line that I think few of us understand, as well as people like Marsalis, or the kind of people you've learned from.
You're absolutely right. But the one thing, so I loved Sonny's Blues, but the character was wrong, that Coltrane and Miles Davis and all the bebop guys who came later understood, they didn't understand originally what they owed to people like Louis Armstrong. And they thought they called him a moldy fig, that he was sort of out of the past. And they were the guys who were setting the course for the future. All of them ended up learning that, in fact, they were standing on the shoulders of Louis Armstrong, and he continued to innovate. And that's why he lasted 50 years. That's why at age 63, he got huge pleasure with his Hello Dolly song of bumping the Beatles from #1 on the Billboard list. And that's why Miles Davis was buried across from Duke Ellington in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, that they all understood that these were the giants and that bebop came and went.
They were on their shoulders, no doubt about that. And I'm getting some questions that I want to go to. In fact, we welcome your questions. I have a lot that I want to spotlight on each of these geniuses and these great contributors to what I call an indigenous art in America, jazz. The first question is from Reed in Santa Rosa, who says, your body of work reflects such an eclectic and wide-ranging set of interests. I was sort of asking you this before initially, how do you go about choosing what to research and write next? Easy answer with the Pullman Porters, but let's look at the body of work now.
I think you and Reed, again, are both being polite. And the question is really, why are my interests all over the place and writing about things that I know so little about. And it is partly the journalist in me. Every journalist is a dilettante, and you go into work every morning not knowing a topic, and by the end of the day, you've got to become at least expert enough to be able to write a story about it. And to me, so most historians and professionally trained historians have a body of work, and every new book they write is some offshoot of that same piece. With me, it's whatever I find fascinating and want to be able to spend 3 years going deep on. And the idea of being, after spending 3 years researching the life of Joe McCarthy, my publisher's reward to me was, after being in that darkness for all that time, spending 3 years with guys as uplifting as Ellington, Armstrong, and Basie. But it's also using the lens into a narrow story, into the life of Duke Ellington or Louis Armstrong, to tell a bigger story, which is the story of Jim Crow in America.
And here's Colleen, who wants to know, in your research, what were some of the most surprising or little-known facts you uncovered about these musical legends?
So if we can take the most enigmatic of my trio of musicians, who was Count Basie. The world knew a whole lot about Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong, but Count Basie was a guy who, by definition, was reticent, even as he was heartfelt, and he wanted to stay in the background. With him, it was all about his band. And what I learned was that secrecy that he sort of showed throughout his life came naturally, because when he was a child growing up in Red Bank, he found out only later that his parents had had a third son who died very young. They were too poor. They were unmarried. They farmed this child out to a local woman in Red Bank. The child died of malnutrition, and he had secrets buried in his past that only modern techniques of genealogy helped me to uncover, that gave a sense of a home life that set a pattern of enigma and reticence for the rest of his life. I learned that Duke Ellington, as we talked earlier, kept saying anytime anybody asked that his music spoke for himself. But I learned, the deeper I dug, that he was a liberal, if not a radical, when it came to civil rights, always. And he just did things that he didn't want to publicize. He did a sit-in with students at Johns Hopkins when they were trying to integrate an eatery in Baltimore. It was something that he said he would never do, and then he did. Louis Armstrong, it doesn't take much research to go back and see that in the signature civil rights battle of the 1950s, which was desegregating the schools in Little Rock, Arkansas, there was a racist governor named Orville Faubus who was trying to keep black kids out of the schools. And Dwight Eisenhower, who was the president then, did very little to help these kids. And the person who was the most outspoken in calling out the governor and calling Eisenhower, our war hero president, gutless, was Louis Armstrong. And he did it in a way that defied all the characterizations of him as an Uncle Tom, and he did it in a way that helped convince Eisenhower to send in the troops to protect the kids.
Yeah, but I remember, as I'm sure you do, and I think you write about it. In fact, you do write about it, when Duke Ellington got the Medal of Freedom from Richard Nixon in 1969. And there was a sense of strong criticism of him because of the hatred of Nixon and because things were very polarized then, not even nearly as polarized as they are now, but there was a lot of political polarization. How could you get a medal from Richard Nixon was what a lot of people on the left were saying at the time, yeah?
On the one hand, that was true. And on the other hand, Ellington had enough of a sense of history to know that the Republicans, the party of Lincoln, was the one who was much better until maybe the Kennedy era on civil rights, and that while Nixon was horrible on lots of issues, on civil rights he did enough that Ellington felt comfortable going to the White House. But it was also, as you say, a less divisive time. And Ellington got medals and awards from everybody from LBJ and JFK to Nixon. And these guys were not partisan. They were willing to accept things from anybody who was willing to have them in and give a voice to them. And how do you turn down a Medal of Honor?
Well, you know that old line about how do you get to Carnegie Hall? You practice, practice, practice. Duke Ellington was there over 20 times in Carnegie Hall. I mean,
He was
extraordinary to think about that just in itself. I've got another question for you. Could you talk a little bit first, though, about women jazz artists? I mean, of course, there were Lady Day and Thelma Carpenter and Ella Fitzgerald. They were mainly singers, weren't they?
So they were. They were singers, and they were singers because it was very hard for women then to be accepted in bands as instrumentalists, and almost no band leaders as women. And I looked around and wanted to have a book that wasn't titled Jazzmen, but Jazz People or something, and to find a woman who belonged in the same pantheon. And almost all the women that were successful in the jazz world back then were vocalists. And they faced double stigmas. They faced the stigma of being black, and they faced the stigma of being women, to the point where they were called canaries or warblers. And even Ellington, Armstrong, and Basie, who had gone through all the guff that they had taken for being black, treated women in a way that was not always respectful. And there was only one. So if you look at Merriam-Webster's dictionary, by the way, if you are looking for the word jazzman, you will find it very clearly defined there. If you're looking for jazz woman, you'll find that there is no such word, which to me was partly a reflection of, and partly maybe a setting a pace for the way society treated women in jazz. And there was only one jazz woman who managed to defy all those low expectations for women, and that was a woman named Lillian Hardin, whose last name for a while was Armstrong, Louis Armstrong's wife. She was a brilliant piano player. She was a composer. She was an arranger, and she was also a band leader. And she was a rarity.
Well, he had 4 wives, in fact. We should
He did.
say that for the record.
So he did. He had 3 very short-lived wives, and he had one who lasted for a long time, and whom he very overtly cheated on.
Here's Sam from Chicago. Good question. I'm sort of testing your impression skills here, maybe. He says, who are figures today that you think will be writing about 80 or 100 years from now?
So in the jazz world, I hope the 2 figures that I've already mentioned are people we'll be writing about, and they are Wynton Marsalis and Jon Batiste. Another one who I loved interviewing 2 or 3 times, and who's somebody who I think will last forever in jazz, is a guy named Sonny Rollins. But other figures will be writing about Michael Krasny, and we won't be writing about Larry Tye 50 or 100 years from now.
Your modesty is bewitching, but I have to admit that Sonny Rollins is one of my favorite artists, jazz artists. I mean, he's in really the top of the hierarchy in terms of Krasny's value of jazz artists. If you don't know Sonny Rollins' work, strongly urge you to find out more about him, listen to him, hear him. We're going to also talk about, if we can, some of the mobsters who play a role in your book with these great jazz artists.
2 of them that I'm particularly interested in, because they make 2 points in my mind, are guys named Dutch Schultz and Meyer Lansky. And the reason mobsters got involved in jazz was during Prohibition, which was at the height of the jazz age, when alcohol was prohibited to be sold over the counter. They sold it under the counter in bars called speakeasies. And the way they attracted patrons to those bars, they smartly understood that jazz artists, if you had a Louis Armstrong or a Duke Ellington band, people were going to come in and you could make a fortune selling them liquor. And so they were patrons for jazz artists. They were protectors for jazz artists who faced a lot of tough characters. And if you had Dutch Schultz on your side, you were in pretty good stead. But the other thing I love about those 2 in particular is they're reflective of what I think was a brilliant alliance in the last century, a Black-Jewish alliance that was nowhere stronger than in the jazz world. All 3 of my jazz guys had Jewish managers, they had Jewish bandmates, and they had Jewish friends. And Louis Armstrong, when he was growing up poor in New Orleans with just his mother at home, he was adopted, the not officially adopted, but adopted in terms of taken under the wing by a Jewish family in New Orleans named Karnofsky, a family
They were
of
Lithuanian Jews, in fact.
They were Lithuanian Jews. They were rag peddlers, what you would have called in Yiddish shmati salesmen, and they understood that to attract attention to their rag wagon, if you had a kid who could play a horn, that would be a way of letting people know that the peddlers were coming down the street. Louis Armstrong blew that horn. Louis Armstrong ate dinner with them. Louis Armstrong listened to Mrs. Karnofsky sing lullabies, and along with the gospel church music, his Jewish lullabies were one of his early inspirations. And for the rest of his life, Louis Armstrong wore around his neck a Star of David.
And schmate may be a Boston version accent of what I grew up hearing as schmata, which is maybe has to do with Litvaks and Galicianers, or something along those lines.
Yes.
In fact, the name Satchmo for Louis Armstrong was thought to be a Yiddish name, and it was for a while there were these rumors that he spoke Yiddish and understood Yiddish. I think some of that has been by Snopes. Well, we've been disabused of some of that, but the reality is that Satchmo had more to do with collecting pennies in his mouth. He had this big mouth, right?
He had a mouth that was as big as a satchel, and they called him Satchel Mouth. And then a British critic, when he landed on his first trip to England, shortened Satchel Mouth to Satchmo. And Satchmo liked it enough. Louis liked it enough. He was willing to have anybody call him anything they wanted. His mother insisted on Louis. A couple of his wives and girlfriends liked better Louis. Satchmo, Satchel Mouth. Louis said that as long as they call me in time for dinner, I don't care what they call me.
Well, they also called him a great American. I mean, he went and met the Pope, for example. He was carried on through the streets of the Congo on people's shoulders. I mean, in many ways, this gets to the heart of your book and the thesis in your book. He was identified with the United States of America and not necessarily with just Black America.
So they used to say in the 50s and through the 60s that the two most identifiable figures of American culture were Mickey Mouse and Louis Armstrong. Everybody everywhere in the world knew not just the sound of his trumpet, but they knew the sound of his voice. And the sound of his voice was the sound that kids in Chicago were convinced sounded like you had a cold. And so in the middle of winter, lots of Chicago kids who wanted to emulate Louis Armstrong went around in their cars with the windows down, hoping they would catch cold and sound like Louis Armstrong. But they were such important ambassadors that the State Department actually sent them around the world and sent Duke Ellington behind the Iron Curtain to represent America. One of the Soviet Union's biggest arguments against America was our racism. And if you sent Duke Ellington in as the antidote to that argument, when these guys were in America, they were willing to criticize anybody on the way, all the way up to the president. As soon as they left our borders, they became patriotic Americans. And when they were asked in Moscow, what about racism back home? They said, it's been a problem and we're fixing it.
There was some real differences, though, in terms of class backgrounds. You talked about Louis Armstrong coming from the battlefield in this terrible neighborhood in New Orleans, and Duke Ellington. But the reality was Duke Ellington was born into the black bourgeoisie, though, wasn't he?
He was. Louis was poor and the son of a 17-year-old mother. The Count Basie was a little bit wealthier. His mother was a laundress. His father was a butler. Duke Ellington was the closest, as you say, to a black bourgeoisie. The most successful black community in America was in Washington, D.C. The largest was in Washington, D.C. And Duke Ellington's mother played the piano. The family was cultured. The father worked as a caterer at the White House. He grew up with opportunities the other two didn't have, and that was reflected in the nickname he gave himself, which was Duke. When he was a child, he would walk down the stairs in his house with his little cousins instructed that as he came down the stairs, the boys should bow, the girls should curtsy, and they should all applaud him. And he said, someday I'm going to be known as the great Duke Ellington. And he was right.
Since he was, what, about 6 years old?
Since he was about 6 years old. And my favorite of all of his nicknames, though, was one given to him by the Duke of Wales, who said, "You should be called the Duke of Hot." And that is precisely what he was.
Well, speaking of hot, Louis Armstrong's first band was called Hot Five, and perhaps in some ways maybe the best recording band when he looked back. And that's the band that gave us like Sleepy Time Down South, which was his signature, his first big hit.
So that's the band that gave us more jazz standards than any band. The two best bands, I would argue, maybe in the history of jazz, were Louis Armstrong's Hot Fives, and after that, his Hot Sevens. And next year is the 100th anniversary of the first recording of the Hot Fives, and they were amazing. But the woman who was behind that, first, the woman who was playing the piano for that and the woman who was pushing him to go out on his own and make his own recordings was his second and short-lived wife, Lil Hardin Armstrong. And so if there was a woman behind every successful man, Lil was certainly the one behind Louis.
But to your way of thinking, Count Basie was the most enigmatic. I think that's the word you use. Why?
It is. Because he didn't want us to know anything about him. He was quiet. He wanted the band to take center stage, and he thought the ultimate role of a band leader was to be the glue behind the scenes. And he was just, by disposition, he was a private guy. The idea of being a band leader was as much out front as he wanted to be, but he also realized that he would ultimately be judged by whether he could pick the right sidemen and get them to stick around, and he did. And he gave his sidemen more credit than Duke Ellington ever did his guys.
Well, there were some extraordinary sidemen. I mean, you think about Lester Young and one of the greatest musicians of all jazz history and so forth, playing with Count Basie. I mean, you look at the sidemen and you get a whole history just in itself with each of them.
You do. And you look at also the idea that Count Basie attracted singers of the caliber of Billie Holiday, and you say, geez, that was amazing. And Billie Holiday, as we know, had a wonderful affair with Lester Young. And it was
That's right. We got a question. One of our regular listeners wants to know about, this is Reed again, about Superman. And by the way, Larry has such a body of work that if any of you want to ask about, I don't mean to put all the focus on this is his newest book, and it's a book, obviously, that he wants people to read and wants it promoted, but there are other books that you may have familiarity with and other figures that he's written about. In fact, I want to get your thoughts a little bit about Bobby Kennedy Jr., if there's anything you want to put in the mix there. But this is Reed saying, regarding Superman, I was fascinated by Superman as a boy, had the comics, watched the TV show. My father had been a fraternity brother of one of the recurring actors, Herb Vigran, who sent me an 8x10 signed photo of George Reeves. That's a whole saga in itself. I mean, George Reeves and his life, and you captured it very well. But there's also what you were talking about before. There's kind of a Jewish connection again with Superman, a major one.
So the two creators of Superman were two Jewish kids from Cleveland, Ohio, teenagers at the time, named Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. It was on the eve of World War II. Jews in America, as around the world, needed a hero. And what better hero than creating the ultimate superhero, Superman? And they had all kinds of little hints in the earliest comic books about the fact that Superman was Jewish. And most importantly, Siegel and Shuster, who were two sort of schlubby-looking kids, believed if anybody had been insightful enough to look deep into them, they would see this wasn't some mild-mannered Clark Kent that they were really Supermen too. And I think that it's also not accidental, I ought to say, that the creators of Superman and Batman and many of our greatest early superheroes were Jews. And it was because Jews couldn't get entry into the white shoe professions like advertising and writing novels. So they took the writing jobs they could get and they wrote us brilliant characters like Superman.
There's also a whole interpretation, kind of a literary interpretation of Superman, an exile from another planet, and the identification with Jewish history.
Everywhere. The whole story, the backstory is there. His Kryptonian name, Kal-El, meant all-embracing God in Hebrew. And it was just, there were all these hints, and they weren't so subtle.
Yeah, and speaking of God, I was struck by something that came across to me in your book about, you think about somebody like Duke Ellington with thousands of musical scores and so forth, but he said that what affected him the most, or what was in his mind his best work, was the work that was done about sacred concerts. I think that was the title, wasn't it? Sacred Concerts?
And it was performed for the first time in San Francisco.
In Grace Cathedral, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And he loved the idea. At the end, he said, I spent more time fending off invitations from churches and synagogues than from nightclubs. And he loved the idea. He was a man of deep faith, and he loved the idea that he could take his music from the church setting that he had first heard it when he was growing up in the church to churches in later life, and that he could be expressive about issues like God. And he said that the thing that most moved him of any reaction he ever got to his music was a young girl who came up to him after a sacred concert and said, I'm a fallen Catholic and you made me put my cross back on.
How do they reconcile that? I mean, individually with the seventh commandment?
They didn't.
The violations of the second.
They didn't. They just, so it was incredible. I got to tell you a quick story if I can, which is I was given an amazing tour of Harlem by a woman named Mercedes Ellington, Duke's granddaughter. And she took me to everywhere that Duke played. She took me to everywhere that Duke lived. But the largest number of stops was she took me everywhere to where Duke stashed his mistresses across Harlem. And even his granddaughter knew at the time this was a guy who could never be satisfied with just one woman at a time.
Don't mean a thing if it doesn't have that swing, I guess, epitomizes that anyways.
Yeah.
These artists, though, were really dedicated deep down to the idea of racial justice, and yet to a great extent, they had to live under, the rules of Jim Crow and segregation and so forth without being able to rebel, without being able to join some kind of, you think about SNCC under Stokely Carmichael, you think about Farrakhan and Malcolm X and so forth. That was all pretty much later, even though you take us from the 20s to the 60s. But there was Marcus Garvey, and the Negro Improvement Association, who felt that, he was a Pan-Africanist, he wanted to go back to Africa, but at the same time, he felt that, there had to be equality. And there were certainly blacks who were making those arguments and fighting and being what came to be called militant by the 60s.
That is the exciting part of my book, was realizing the way these guys were militants in their own ways. Duke Ellington, scored a theater production called Jumping for Joy, where he had songs like King Fit the Battle of Alabama, which was about the horrible Bull Connor, the police chief in Birmingham, hosing down black demonstrators and black children. And Duke wrote that play with the notion that, as he put it, he was going to take Uncle Tom out of the theater. These guys were revolutionaries, and all the leaders of the Harlem Renaissance movement, the great artistic revival of black culture and black activism, recognized that, as I said earlier, we were talking about these guys writing the soundtrack for the Civil Rights Revolution. They sure as heck also wrote the soundtrack for the Harlem Renaissance.
The Harlem Renaissance was really, in some ways, predating what came to be known as the Black Arts Movement, which didn't begin really to dawn until the 60s to some great degree. But there was certainly a lot of awareness in the Harlem Renaissance about folklore and about black idioms and metaphors and going back and recovering all that. In fact, just reading your book and thinking about something Richard Wright said, who comes along a little later, but wrote a famous collection called Uncle Tom's Children, very revealing title, before he wrote Native Son. And Wright talked about the Negro, as you say, that was the common word used for black people at the time. The Negro is America's metaphor. That speaks volumes to really what you're getting at, doesn't it?
It does, and speaking volumes and at a loud volume was Duke's famous opera called Black, Brown, and Beige. And he tried to tell the story of, as he put it, Negro America, everything from slavery to emancipation to Jim Crow and liberation, tried to tell it through his music. And he said that jazz should be renamed Negro music. And that was, he had extraordinary racial pride, but more than just having the pride, he did something to strike a blow for black rights and for human rights in a way that I think we ought to see as the other half of these guys' legacy. They were great musicians, and you don't need Larry Tye coming along and telling you that, but telling you that they were also extraordinary activists and incredibly effective activists. You need me and Martin Luther King helping fill in that story.
Well, it was indeed what could have been called at that time Negro music. But then you had people come along like Dave Brubeck, and there were certainly those who have been part of the great jazz contributions of our time that were simply Caucasian.
They were, but even them, so Dave Brubeck was Louis Armstrong's biggest promoter and fan, and they worked together, and he understood that he was partly borrowing black culture. Brubeck understood in creating his great jazz. The other night at the opening party for my book, my conversant was a guy named Gary Burton, maybe the second most famous vibraphonist in American history. And Gary Burton, who's now 83, said, I played with Duke Ellington and I stood on his shoulders. And all the really smart, great white jazz performers and all the Jewish ones, and there were loads of Jewish ones, said this is the black art form that we're helping expand, but they understood the black roots.
Jerry from Aurora, Colorado says, these three great musicians, what do you think their opinion might be of groups such as Black Lives Matter that call for confrontation and demeaning police?
So I am not sure I accept all that characterization of what Black Lives Matter is, but I think that all I can say is these guys survived for 50 years and they stayed at the cutting edge, not just of the musical world, but of the push for racial justice. And I think they'd be out there saying something that was, on the one hand, more healing, but on the other hand, was considered pretty radical, because I think they were radicals in their times.
Well, you talk about this, what you call the secret language of jazz. I mean, it does have its own kind of jive idiom and all the rest of it. And one of those words is ofe, which is probably continued to be debated about even to the present day. Some say, oh, that's Pig Latin for foe, and that's talking about white people, secretly talking about white people. But there's a lot of other theories, just like Satchmo's name has a lot of different theories.
So I don't think it was not a nice term that Louis Armstrong and others used occasionally about whites, and they saved it for whites that they felt were really racist. But I think that having their own language let them communicate in a way. This was a world of improvisation where jazz was a new language, and the idea that they actually converted that into words that only they could understand, let them talk to one another in a setting where fans were around and they could have some sense of privacy, but it also gave them a sense they were written out of a lot of the elegant society of the times, and this gave them a sense that they had their own lingo and they had their own culture. And I think it was something pretty special.
Well, it's still the case. I mean, you go to certain black areas, urban areas and so forth, the language is changing almost as we're speaking here. And there's a lot of that language that remains exclusively part of the black argot or the black ways of communicating. You mentioned specifically handkerchief head and sandman.
Yeah, so those are wonderful terms that are terms for people who are not exactly upstanding citizens. All of these words were used by the Pullman Porters as well as black jazz artists, and they were part of the Negro League baseball world. There was, long before there was anything called the Green Book, there was this informal network communicating among blacks who were on the road, and there weren't many groups of blacks who were. And the Pullman porters told the Negro Leaguers where it was safe to stay in a particular town. Mrs. Smith might take in boarders and cook a good meal. It was a way of staying alive as well as sort of staying plugged in.
Well, I alluded to this before. I don't want to let it hang here, but I've got to ask you, especially with Bobby Kennedy Jr. being so much in the news, what do you think his father would have thought about this run if he were alive? Again, you've been asked to speculate a number of times in this time we've had with you, and be appreciative of anything you can shed in the way of light on that, because the whole Kennedy family is against him.
So I think that Bobby would wish that this wasn't the child that was carrying his name around, because I think if he were Douglas or if he were Joe or any of the other Kennedy, of the 11 Kennedy children, headline writers and others would have less fun with it. The idea that they can go with RFK Jr. is just an easy fix for them. And I think Bobby would be distressed. I know my neighbor here where I'm talking to you from on Cape Cod is Joe Kennedy, Bobby Jr.'s older brother. And I know how distressed Joe is. And I think that all of his kids, and most importantly, his mother, Ethel, is really distressed by all of this. Distressed by everything from the vaccine, the anti-vax part of RFK Jr. to the anti-Democrat part.
Probably distressed by a worm in his brain that turned up too, I imagine. I mean, that's a crazy kind of thing I know they must care about him despite the fact that they may be distressed about his political moves. I'd like you to speculate about something else, because I interviewed you about your Bobby Kennedy book. And soon after that, Chris Matthews had a Bobby Kennedy book, and I interviewed him. And he seemed very exercised. I don't want to get inside baseball here, but about your book. And I couldn't understand why. Do you have any notion as to why?
So I don't. My guess is because my book came out a year before his book and got some attention, but I have no idea. And I never talked to him about it. All I know is that the people who I cared about, there was one person whose reaction to my book I cared about more than anybody in the world, and that's the woman I just mentioned, and that was Ethel Kennedy. And she became my pal. And I think that I tried to look at not just Bobby's career as the liberal icon we knew him as at the end of his career, but as the Joe McCarthy acolyte and protege that he was at the beginning of his career. And I think that some people may have been upset that that they felt I overdrew the Joe McCarthy connection, but the one who reinforced my sense of that being an incredibly important part of Bobby's life was Ethel.
Well, he was, along with Roy Cohn, right-hand man for McCarthy, basically.
He was.
Literally right.
Had it not been for Roy Cohn, Bobby probably would have been chief of staff, and we may have had a very different Bobby at the end if he had stuck around with Joe McCarthy.
Well, speaking about the friendship you had with Ethel Kennedy, there was another woman that you forged a friendship with and actually wrote a book with. That was Kitty Dukakis.
So we collaborated on a book about a treatment. Kitty Dukakis had and talked publicly about her drug issues. She was addicted to diet pills. About her alcohol issues, she was an alcoholic. She would say she is an alcoholic, but one who had been dry forever. She also had serious mental health issues. And we wrote a book about the treatment that she got, which was ECT, more popularly known as electric shock therapy. And she got it, and she said it saved her life. And we wrote a book where every other chapter was her first-person story and my looking at the medical and scientific evidence behind it.
That was an important book because thanks to, Ken Kesey and Sylvia Plath and a number of others who come to mind, shock therapy of any kind was looked on as being baleful and terrible. And yet there have been now recorded results that are pretty impressive to a small degree. The problem was it was used more than it should have been used and to a greater quantity.
Yes. So it was used in a cruder form and in a across-the-board way that was never appropriate. But if you ask the head of the National Institute of Mental Health, what is the singly most effective treatment for all kinds of serious mental health issues, while it may be one that people still cringe at, it is ECT, electric shock.
Anything you're working on now, Larry, that we should know about?
I am.
What are you doing?
So I'm
Can you
working
talk
on
about
a
it?
book. I can, and I love to talk about it. And it's a story I've wanted to tell for a long time. It is about Jewish resistance to the Holocaust. And it is a story that I'm going to tell through the life of a guy who died a year ago at age 97 named Adolfo Kaminsky. And he was known as the Forger of Paris. And in his obituaries in the New York Times and every newspaper around the world, he was credited with saving 10,000 lives. He was a teenage forger. He may have been the best forger in the world. And he created false documents for people that let them escape Hitler or let them go underground. And I think it's a book that's taking on the still too prevalent narrative that all Jews went like lambs to slaughter. And in fact, in all kinds of ways, against odds that were totally overwhelming, Jews, scores, millions, fought back, and the toll of the Holocaust would have been a whole lot higher had they not.
Well, there was a book called They Fought Back, which I think documented a lot of what you've described, and there was the Warsaw Ghetto. So
it's true, and what I'm trying to do...
the stereotypes don't hold up, yeah.
So they don't hold up, and what I'm trying to do is what we started out by talking about is tell through a compelling personal narrative this bigger story. The bigger story has been told. I think that the only way a broader public will focus on it is if you can tell it through one compelling life that makes that broader fighting back case.
Isn't it fascinating, though, how that one life can really tell a story that many people can get, as opposed to, you start using that number 6 million and it begins to lose its meaning. Mine can't even get around 100, let alone 6 million.
So it takes a storyteller like you to be able to bring a story like that alive, but it is true. It's always, we're a nation that loves a good story, and the more personal it is, the better.
And could you say something quickly before we say goodbye about this health coverage fellowship that you're involved in?
Sure. So we're going into our 23rd year. Every year we bring a dozen of the best journalists from across the country whose beat is health, and we try to make them a little bit better at covering issues ranging from mental health to pandemics by bringing in 75 of the smartest health experts, from the head of the CDC and the NIH to all kinds of other places. And the theory is, if you bring smart journalists in, give them 10 days and nights where they don't have to worry about deadlines, they will be able to learn from one another and learn from the experts in a way they can't on their daily deadline beat.
Well, you're doing an amazing amount, and my kudos to you. Also have to say that when I think of Cape Cod, I always think of Patty Page, but it's been many years since I've been there. And I know it's gone through some real changes. That's a whole maybe topic in itself. But let me first thank all of you who joined us for this live episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, which you can listen to live on Fridays at 11 a.m. Pacific time, or on Apple, Spotify, on our website at graymatter.show. If you haven't yet become a member of this podcast, I invite you to join us, urge you to do so by going to our website at graymatter.show, where you can find previous episodes of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, and that's Gray with an E. Also invite you to mail any reactions or suggestions you might have to me at mkrasny@graymatter.show. And special thanks to our Gray Matter Michael Krasny team, Alex, Shannon, Chad, Kevin, Colin, Jeff, and Colleen. And a special thanks to this week's special guest, Larry Tye. I'm Michael Krasny.
Bandwidth for Gray Matter is provided by CashFly at CACHEFLY.com.